Let's go back to the fundamental assumption that all people, and this also includes all beings whatsoever, but we're talking mainly, of course, about human beings. All people are manifestations, disguises of the total reality behind this cosmos. And that if that is so, there are not any mistakes in the world. When you look at patterns on the foam of the breaking waves on the seashore, and you look at the outlines of mountains, and the grain in wood, and the markings on marble, you notice that it never makes an aesthetic mistake. Never. Also, when you study plants, and you go into their relationships with each other and with insects, the fact that the so-called diseases of plants are the full life of some other kind of organism having a ball, and you see this complexly interrelated world, and you realize that it all hangs together, that everything outside the human world is a system of balances where you couldn't have really any form of life without the others going on too. There have to be friends and there have to be enemies. Because if there aren't enemies, the friends get too prosperous and they kill themselves by their excessive exuberance. So they're constantly being pruned by various kinds of enemy species. And what is, when you got down there and you suppose you identified yourself with a certain plant, you would thoroughly object to, if you were a lettuce, to the snails eating you up. And also a person who gets identified with lettuces, you see, say somebody who grows lettuces for his living, gets mad at the snails. But actually, lettuces need snails, because there would be too many lettuces if there weren't snails. And those lettuces would choke each other. Now, of course, a human being comes in and starts organizing the lettuces, you see, so that the seeds don't propagate in the usual way, because he puts them out in rows. And that's a different kind of a scene. And so he objects to the snails. But that's because he's looking at the problem of lettuces from a partisan point of view. And it's quite right that he should do so. What he may not see, because he's taken the side of lettuces against snails, he fails to see that conflict at one level is health at another. Just as conflict going on between microorganisms in your bloodstream is absolutely essential to the health of your organism as a whole. But you're not aware of that conflict going on, because conscious attention doesn't need ordinarily to focus upon it. And so you don't get involved, and you're not anxious about what party is winning and what party is losing. They're keeping up a kind of balance. Now then, to take this a step further, we are all amazingly involved in the process of being human and playing our game and taking our side. And therefore our victories and defeats, our sicknesses and our healths, are things we get mighty partisan about. And therefore we cannot see that human behavior is just like everything else. It never makes a mistake. Only its never making a mistake must include the feeling that mistakes can be made. See, that's where this point of view would differ somewhat from the point of view of a Christian Scientist, who strives manfully, in a way, to assert that evil is purely illusory, but doesn't quite grasp the point that the illusion of there being something evil is important and good too. We're not trying to get rid of it, you see, because if you get rid of it, you would have problems. I could say, for example, that a character, a historical character like Hitler, is someone about whom it is very natural for most of us to feel angry. And that's perfectly right that we feel angry, although he is as much a natural phenomenon as an earthquake. So what we have then is a system of a sort of hierarchy, of levels. And at the point where you are involved, you can't stand aside from yourself and look at it objectively in the same way as you look at the patterns of foam on the seashore, or as the life of the fishes in the tide pools. But to be liberated is to be able to see human life in the same way as you see all other life. And to do that, you have to be able to live, as it were, on two levels: the level of involvement and the level of detachment. And therefore, cultivating the level of detachment is something that is done through the mysterious human property of self-consciousness. To be able to know that you know, to feel that you feel. And by possessing that faculty, which is self-consciousness, is being able to reflect upon one's own life, we are able to become, as it were, to go to a level at which our own life is seen in its total context in the universe. That is to say, to realize that yourself is not your ego, which is the standpoint at which you are involved in your game and taking sides, but yourself is the eternal, immeasurable reality that is what there is. Only the difficulty here is that this capacity of self-consciousness, although it is that which enables us to awaken, is also capable of getting us into perfectly frightful messes, into all kinds of what must be called feedback snarls, where you know that you know, and you can think about thinking. And the moment you can think about thinking, you can think whether your thinking was right or not. Did it come off? Did I do the right thinking? Then you start to worry. Then you start to worry about the kind of thinking you are doing about thinking. And so builds up our peculiar human anxiety. When these creatures that are not self-conscious behave, they behave spontaneously. They just go zoom, zowie, and do what they have to do. And so if it doesn't work, they die. But they don't worry about it in advance. That's that. It's magnificent, you see. And human beings have a faint memory, kind of archaic, sort of collective unconscious Jungian style feeling that there was a time when we didn't have to worry, and when we could never be neurotic. And a great deal of religion, you see, is an attempt to regain the golden age, the paradise lost. And so it involves, as it were, an attitude of surrender. Be not anxious for the morrow, what you shall eat, what you shall drink, or what clothes you will wear. For consider the flowers of the field. They don't work, they don't spin, they don't gather into barns. And yet Solomon, in all his splendor, was not clothed like one of those. And so if God clothes the grass of the field, which exists today and is thrown tomorrow into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, faithless ones? I'm translating it myself to put it in a way that isn't just so familiar that you don't hear it. Now, I mean, that's totally subversive. These words in the Bible are outrageous. Everybody says, well, it's all very well for Jesus and a few saints and people like that. For all practical purposes, that's ridiculous. You can't live that way. After all, you've got to plan for your old age. You've got to have a savings account. You've got to have insurance. You've got to have a job. You've got to do all those things. See? So you have to think about that. Why can't I do that? So you see, in this way, the human being comes to reflect upon himself and begins to see that there's something wrong. Now, there isn't. But it's right that he should feel that something is wrong, because it is through this that his capacity for self-knowledge and self-consciousness develops. So you see, there is the sense that somehow or other at some time there was a fall, a point at which we became unnatural. There's a great deal of worry going on about this now because of the rise of the computer. You know this? This is terribly interesting. That a new form of intelligence, you see, has come into the world, which is in certain directions vastly superior to human intelligence. And people are beginning to worry like anything about whether the machines are going to take us over. But we've got to realize that machines aren't... See, machine is becoming a dirty word. Just a machine, mere machinery, you see? But actually, there has grown out of us, through these things, enormous electronic circuits that are new forms of life. And these are all connected with us. They're not separate from us. They're not something like a different order of beings that might come from some other planet and conquer us. The whole development of the electronic minds and brains that we have are new cortexes. See, the cortex overlaps the original central brain. And as it were, when you play this game, you know, putting hands over hands over hands, as children like to play, it's a game called capping. But the cortex caps the central brain that is more like the brain of an animal and enables us to reflect on it. Now, all this machinery that we are making is an extension of our brain and is a new kind of life. But it worries us. And when we start to do that, we get the feeling something is going wrong. There has been a fall. There has been a mistake. And exactly the same sensation, you see, is anciently connected with the development of self-consciousness in the cortex. Something went wrong. Because every time we get that feeling, it means that we've taken a new step in controlling things. Instead of relaxing and letting our wings fly us like a moth or a bird, we now have these jet planes where we have an elaborate system of anxious people, morning, noon, and night, checking it that those things go right. And it's marvelous that they do. Our friend Ralph Johnson, who often attends these seminars, is an American Airlines captain, and he saved a jet the other day in very dangerous circumstances. Fantastic. But here it is. Now, when you haven't yet discovered that the new development, such as self-consciousness, is really a new form of nature, like a branch coming out of a tree, which is a kind of a new development of the trunk. And it's something just as healthy and just as splendid as that. Then you begin to reproach yourself and say, oh dear, I am awful. You begin to be alienated, you see, from your own center. But do you understand that being alienated from your own center is a form of, a way of stepping apart so that you can see yourself? Now that's important. That is resonance. See, when you sing in the bathtub, you find you've got a better voice than when you sing in a non-resonant room, because you've got a little echo. You mustn't get too much echo. But just a little echo is resonance, and that's more fun because it's more conscious. If you're happy and you don't know you're happy, you see, you're not as happy as if you know you're happy. But if you know you're happy, you may spoil it by getting anxious about it. So this self-consciousness is a kind of resonance. But then you see, when it gets to the point of this terrible feeling, I can't trust my instincts anymore. I've got to decide. I have, as it were, taken over the prerogatives of God. Well, that's a terrible thing to do, because you can't be genuine anymore. You see? You know that when you love somebody, you also want to get as much out of them as you can. You know that when you act as a responsible citizen, you do so as to have a good image in your own view of yourself. It's your ego kick. Only you dress it up so that it's not an ego kick at all, but perfectly sincere public service and charity and good feelings towards everybody. Ha ha! And so then there begins this awful thing, repentance. Behold, I was shapen in sin, and in sin hath my mother conceived me. And so somehow there comes up this state of mind when you appear to yourself as rotten. Some people, when they take LSD, get visions of everything is glorious, you see, and is light inside it. But occasionally people get the vision that everything is corrupt, that all faces are things that are slowly drooling away into sort of pussy rot, and that just everything is falling apart. And they begin to get the feeling that life is a disease. We originally had here a nice clean planet with nothing but rocks and fire, and it was sterile and nice. And then all this dreadful goo developed. And the best thing for it is to wipe it out. Life is a terrible mistake, see? And a lot of people feel that. And therefore want to get away from their bodies to a purely geological electronic state, which is called spirituality. You know what most people think of as spirituality? Something totally abstract, something mathematical, something electronic, something that has no no kind of pus or blood or goo, especially no flesh in it, you see? That's the spiritual state. So that expresses the feeling of these people fundamentally, who are at variance with their essential life. Now, this is going to get complicated, I warn you. They're ambivalent about it. You see, in both Hebrew and Christian, and I should add Islamic theology, sin of which one repents is a spiritual thing. It does not arise from the body. The author of evil is an angel, a bodiless being. And therefore he is something closer to, say, E equals mc squared than to a rosebud. But at the same time, in practice, that's the theory. In practice, what so many Jews, Christians, and Muslims regard as evil is the body, the physical world, and our involvement in it, our interest in it. And so you see, for this reason, materialism is a dirty word. You shouldn't be a materialist, although William Temple very wisely said once that Christianity is the most materialistic religion. But that is true, theoretically. Judaism is an equally materialistic religion, theoretically, sometimes more so practically than the Christian religion. Because materialism is the love of material. And as we shall see, it is fundamental to Judaism that God's creation of the world is not a mistake, but a great good thing, and a material world at that. So then, you can see what I'm pointing out to you is this: how ambivalent we are. We say that evil is spiritual, and yet we treat it as if it were fleshly. As if one could escape from this flesh. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is